Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. For more than a century, the threat of predatory pricing, where one business cuts prices below cost to bankrupt rivals and create a monopoly, has driven much of our economic policy. Predatory pricing was the weapon allegedly behind John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly, and many of our antitrust laws today are designed to restrict this and other predatory practices on the part of corporations. Yet many economists are skeptical whether predatory pricing could ever work to secure monopoly. And the historical record on Standard Oil may surprise you. Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about predatory pricing, the case of Standard Oil, and the relationship of all of this to our antitrust laws is Dr. John Dove of the Johnson Center. Welcome back to the show, John.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, we want to start by telling our viewers a little bit about when economists talk about competition and monopoly, we have very specific things in mind, but these are also terms that are generally used by the average person out there. And so as they're used in common discussion or common language is somewhat different from how economists use it. So let's talk a little bit. We don't need to get into lots of details here. We don't have to turn this into a principles class or anything. But let's get into a little bit about what's the essential differences as we as economists look at it here between competition and monopoly.
Yeah, so just to keep it about as simple as we can to think about competition. It really is like it sounds. In general, it's multiple firms in competition with one another, though it doesn't have to be multiple firms. You can still have competition with one firm. We might get to that, but it's competition between multiple firms trying to get business and consumers from other firms in that industry. The importance of competition for an economist are really some of the incentives that get created, where when competition exists, it tends to drive down prices, which benefits consumers. It also tends to incentivize those firms to find ways to cut costs and to also innovate with what it is that they're trying to do, all really at the benefit of consumers. Monopoly, on the other hand, is generally a situation where you have a single seller. Now, the importance for a monopoly to truly exist, there have to be high barriers to entry. It can't be easy to actually compete or enter that market. When that's the case, well, some of those incentives that exist under competition don't exist anymore. So you have situations where now a firm has the incentive to restrict output or reduce supply, to increase price above what would otherwise exist, and to also reduce quality, and that all is detrimental to consumers.
So, so just to make sure we understand here, is just in terms of the competition versus monopoly, and this would be sort of like the bottom line results of what's the differences are here, right?
Exactly right. That's exactly what the differences would be.
And most importantly, well, one of the things that's important is that consumers end up being worse off under monopoly. They're not going to be served as well. Right?
That's exactly right. And what we mean by that when we say they're going to be worse off, they'll end up paying a relatively higher price than would generally tend to exist where there's competition. Many times you might have inferior quality products, things of that nature. So it leads to a situation where consumers aren't being served as well as they could be if competition actually existed, potentially.
And with competition, another thing that ends up happening is even if one business doesn't choose to innovate or can't control their costs or anything, there are others that might be able to step in and do it and force them to, or force them out of business, right?
That's exactly right, and that's the point behind competition is, where you do have a firm that may be trying to act monopolistically or may not be able to truly innovate and reduce its costs. Well, what ends up happening is, they lose market share, they lose businesses. Consumers, you and I, go to the other businesses that can better provide what it is that you and I want and need. And when that happens, well, those firms end up exiting the market, going out of business, and the businesses and firms that are better able to serve us survive and thrive.
And so competition is really a way to protect consumers from bad things happening to them. Really.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
And you mentioned monopoly would be a single seller. If you had a single firm selling something, competition has to involve seemingly multiple firms trying to compete for a customer's business. Is there some number you can look at here, the number of firms in an industry to say, this is enough firms for so it's competitive, but this is not enough firms, so it's going to be more like monopoly?
Funny enough, technically, I guess you could, but not really, right? I mean, in fact, when it comes to competition, you can have zero competitors. You could have a market that actually looks like a monopolist. What really matters, again, are what are the barriers to entry? How easy is it for me as an entrepreneur or potential competitor to actually enter that industry? If barriers are relatively low, then even if there's actually only one firm in the market, you'll have a situation where that business is actually charging the lowest price that it can. We call that a contestable market. It's a situation where the threat of competition is competition. And this is a really important thing to understand that many people don't really think too much about or realize, is that what is actually technically by definition a monopoly, there's only one business operating in this market, is doing so because it's the one business that can actually get costs as low as possible and ultimately charge the lowest price possible. If it tried to raise those prices, other entrepreneurs would immediately enter that market and drive the price back down.
So a single firm could be competing against potential competition, not just the actual competition that they actually have in the market at any one point in time, right?
That's exactly right, and that's an important point that a lot of people don't realize, and something that public policy for a long time didn't realize. It really wasn't until the 1970s or 80s when public policy, things like antitrust policy, actually started to realize that, well, contestable markets actually really do exist, and most of the time when you look at a market where there is a single seller, it probably is a contestable market.
You got us into the next thing we want to talk about, because from looking at competition versus monopoly, we say monopoly's bad, competition's good, so we like to have competition whenever possible. Now, antitrust are a set of laws that are designed in large part to try to help maintain or ensure competition, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that is really the sole purpose of antitrust law, is to go in and find situations where you may have a monopolistic firm or a firm that's acting monopolistically, and then try to determine and figure out, well, how is it that we can increase competition? Many times the argument goes, what you want to do is break up that dominant firm, make it many smaller firms, because then when you have many smaller firms, they're obviously going to act rivalrously against each other and create that competition, right? Which economists argue is a very good thing for consumers, which is ultimately what we care about. What does consumer welfare look like? Are consumers being made better off or worse off? And that's what antitrust is trying to do, improve consumer well-being.
In the term trust here in antitrust, back in the late 1800s, I think a monopoly or some of these large businesses like Standard Oil were referred to as trust, right? And so that's where specifically, like, well, where is this term exactly coming from? It's from this term trust that was being applied to large businesses at that time, right?
Exactly, right.
And our first antitrust law was passed by Senator, or I guess sponsored by Senator Sherman of Ohio, but it's something that still lives on today, right? We still have antitrust policy in the antitrust laws in the United States today, right?
Oh, very much so. Yes, and it's still very strong and a very major important component to both federal and state policy.
And so it's almost 20 years now, but there was in the 1990s a famous antitrust case brought against Microsoft at the time, and a lot of comparisons that were being made of Microsoft to Rockefeller. Bill Gates being compared to Rockefeller, and
Right.
Microsoft to Standard Oil, and so this was something that was very important, even just in relatively recent time, right?
That's exactly right. And Microsoft is probably the last major case that most people would think about when they actually thought about antitrust. But again, since then there have been a number of other cases, and inevitably, any time that major companies and major corporations talk about merging together, inevitably you have a situation where antitrust regulators, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission will scrutinize that merger to try to determine, well, could this lead to a situation where it might create some sort of monopolistic behavior to the detriment of consumers? And many times, especially now, what we see is that if that is the case, then these mergers won't be approved.
So one component of the antitrust laws, you mentioned the mergers, but when we led off in the introduction, I mentioned this idea of predatory pricing. And so predatory pricing sounds really dangerous. It sounds like a very loaded term as well, perhaps. But if you can, tell us a little bit about what exactly do economists mean by predatory pricing?
Sure. So you can think about it. We're monopoly pricing. That's pricing above what the price would be if there was competition. So and a higher price than under competition. Predatory pricing is the exact opposite of that. It's actually trying to drive down the price as low as you can. And importantly, driving down price below your actual costs. So what that means as a business is I'm charging a price lower than what it costs me to produce and what it also costs any competitors in the market to produce. So I'm taking a loss on everything I produce then. Ultimately, the intent behind predatory pricing then is to force out all of my competition, force them to take losses to take losses and to eventually exit the market as a result of that, which then allows me to become a monopolist.
Okay, so if you had one large firm in the industry, if they could try to in fact, bankrupt their rivals by cutting the price low, keeping the price too low. And this would be cutting beyond what, because in competition, if firms are facing pressure to try to keep prices in line with their costs, if firms are charging too high prices or if new technologies come along that allow firms to lower prices, they'll be cutting prices in competition, but cutting prices to reflect costs, right? So this is definitely well beyond that.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the issue with predatory pricing, or the alleged issue with predatory pricing is that, yeah, obviously in competition, right, when new technologies and new innovations come along, it's going to force you to decrease the price that you charge because it drives down costs overall for the industry. Predatory pricing is something well beyond that. How you go about defining that gets tricky and difficult, but it's a situation where you're cutting those prices, even further, taking a loss on everything simply to drive out your competition, so that in the future you can become a monopoly.
And in the near term, it's definitely going to be costly because you're charging below a price below cost.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why many times when people refer to predatory pricing, they think of it as sort of being, a really extreme price war, in the sense that really every business in that industry is going to be taking losses, even the person the business that is conducting predatory pricing.
And so, but it's not just a price war in the sense of firms get locked into this desire to cut prices, to competitively cut prices. I think a few months ago, some gas stations were selling gas, I think in Michigan, for like 92 cents or some ridiculously low amount of money that clearly couldn't have been covering their costs. So beyond that, it is this intention of we are taking losses, we know we're taking losses, but it's got this larger strategic purpose.
Yeah, that's the overall alleged intent behind predatory pricing, exactly.
Well, I want to get into the historical case here, because one of the, I guess, probably great examples of allegedly predatory pricing in American economic history is the case of Standard Oil. So for those of our viewers who maybe it's been a while since they took their American history class, can you tell us just a little bit briefly about the Standard Oil and John Rockefeller, who he was, and when his company was around?
Yeah, so John Rockefeller, born, I believe, 1839, sounds about right, 1839, 1840. But grew up relatively modest means. His family moved around a lot. They eventually settled in Cleveland, and at an early age, he learned bookkeeping, which is a very valuable skill, and one that he proved to be very good at. So that really kind of gained him some notoriety in the Cleveland business community. And it was from there in roughly 1865 that oil had been discovered in Pennsylvania, and also could be cheaply extracted. So this really sort of set off this boom in the oil industry. So Rockefeller realized that he could get into the actual refining business when it came to oil, and that Cleveland was pretty well situated in order to do that. So he, along with a couple of partners, began Standard Oil, which was a refining company, sort of the intermediate when it comes to oil production.
So if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because there are a few different levels of the oil industry. I mean, we have a picture here of like the old oil derricks,
Right.
but that wasn't really what Standard Oil was into. It's more this refining, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's really taking the crude oil and then turning it into, right, so that's the drilling and everything else. And then taking that crude oil and turning it into actual things that you could use, right? So Vaseline, petroleum. The biggest one for Standard Oil, especially early on, was kerosene. You know, it was became relatively cheap way to light your home and light everything else. And so it was really turning that crude oil into usable products. That was the refining aspect, and then after that, above that, there was the distribution aspect too.
Actually getting the kerosene out to people's homes or businesses that were going to use that. Now, I think it's kind of interesting because although it's a little bit of an aside from our story, I mean, the dissemination or the spread of kerosene as a way to light people's homes at night was really important for American society, wasn't it?
Oh, it was completely revolutionary. I mean, before then, you had whale oil, which was generally pretty expensive, especially at that time, right? A lot of overfishing led to increased prices in whale oil. It was also a resource that was very sporadic. And, you know, even things like candles in general. So whale oil and candles were the two big ways, and those were actually fairly expensive ways of lighting your home at night. So for the average American, and especially for your typical poor American, it was very difficult to actually light your home. And then all of a sudden, kerosene hits the market, and it revolutionized everything.
And so, like, the day could extend past dark, right? Especially like for kids when they were learning, they could actually study and read at night. Kerosene and our activities could extend on, right?
That's exactly right. I think at its peak, you could light your home for about a penny per hour using kerosene, significantly cheaper than anything that had been before it.
So it was in the refining stage that Rockefeller was alleged to have this monopoly, and you could sort of say because eventually the Supreme Court stepped in and broke up Standard Oil, right? And so in one sense, the verdict of history, or at least the verdict of the Supreme Court, was that Standard Oil was a monopolist.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Legally speaking, yes, Standard Oil was considered to be a monopoly. You know, the important thing to keep in mind too is that when you really look at Standard Oil's record, they entered the market in Cleveland in about 1870. By 1875, they had about 4% market share of the refining industry. At its peak, Standard Oil had about 90% market share, which is obviously sizable. But again, right, so the economic definition of a monopoly, right, is that there's one seller. So it's kind of hard to necessarily say that you are a monopoly. So then you have to look, well, are they acting monopolistically? Are they trying to restrict output, increase price, things like that? So that's really what you need to look at. But then importantly, too, even after that, in 1906, which is actually when the case was filed in federal court, Standard Oil's market share was only 70% at that point. By 1911, right, when the Supreme Court came down with its decision, Standard Oil's market share was down to 64%. So what we see is, even if we want to say it was acting monopolistically at one point, which is debatable, right, we still see through natural market forces that there was competition constantly trying to take away market share and successful at taking market share from Standard Oil.
And as long as there's that competition, if Standard Oil is staying on top, the only way they're staying on top is by actually serving consumers, right? By offering a better product or a lower priced product or something.
That's exactly right, and that's what Standard Oil did. They did both, right? They continuously tried to innovate and strive for better products and to produce the better products, which drove down their costs and allowed them to drive down their prices. And that's where the predatory pricing issue came in, right? But what the historical record really shows is that Standard Oil, right, was not actually carrying out any sort of predatory pricing. In general, what they were doing was buying out their competition, merging with their competition. There was no predatory pricing.
So yeah, certainly Standard Oil got big, so they expanded significantly and did acquire a bunch of other refiners. But I guess the historical I guess the consensus or outside of economics, the thought is that predatory pricing was an important part of this. Here's a quote from Ida Tarbell, the muckraking journalist who wrote a famous expose on the Standard Oil company, and she's saying definitely that Rockefeller was using this this pricing strategy to destroy their rivals. Now, so that's sort of like the historical background, but some years ago now, back in 1958, an economist named John McGee wrote amongst economists, especially in the law and economics areas, sort of a famous, now famous article about the Standard Oil case, right?
That's exactly right. And this was actually a really revolutionary article. Prior to his work, economists tended to agree that, Rockefeller, Standard Oil, they had perpetrated predatory pricing in order to drive out their competition. And what McGee did was to sit down and do what economists do and say, well, this is an empirical question, so what's the empirical and historical record show? Was it the case that Standard Oil was actually using predatory pricing to drive out its competition?
And so what did he do to try to do this?
Yeah, so he went through the 11,000+ pages of the actual trial transcripts, and then he also went through and looked at, how is it that Standard Oil was acting and behaving in lots of local markets. And what he found was there was no instance under which Standard Oil had actually used predatory pricing. Again, in general, right, where the bigness came from, where the size increases came from, was buying out its competition, merging with its competition, and where the price reductions came, because that's the important thing, right? What we see is that through the 1800s into the early 1900s, the price of kerosene plummeted. I mean, absolutely plummeted, which is, again, I guess it could be predatory pricing, but it's not, and that's the issue, right? It's just simple competitive forces driving that outcome.
And so here's this conclusion. I think one of the things that was really interesting that emerged in reading his study was that some of the people, the men who owned refineries that got bought out by Rockefeller ended up starting new refineries and competing against him again. And I think that was, I found that really telling in terms of whether they were selling out to Rockefeller due to predatory pricing and being ruined by him or not, right?
That's exactly right. Time and again what we see is that after Standard Oil buys out one of its competitors, that competitor many times, again, re-enters the market and starts a new refinery. The importance of that is to show that, look, again, to be a successful monopolist, you have to have high barriers to entry. I mean, this pretty well shows that, look, those high barriers don't exist, right? Competitors are continually entering and re-entering the market. Predatory pricing itself, too, it's very difficult, right? And this is the economic analysis behind it. It's very difficult to actually carry out, right? What you have are situations where, first off, nobody knows how long, right, this price war is going to take place. So based on that, well, if I'm going to take losses indefinitely, I'm going to be very wary about actually starting any sort of predatory price war to begin with. Second, my rival firm at any point, if they want to, they can just shut down temporarily, right? Businesses do this all the time. My rival can do the same thing if I try to predatory price and then just wait for the dust to settle and re-enter the market, right? So there are all sorts of issues associated with predatory pricing that make it actually very difficult from a practical standpoint to implement and carry out.
And I guess the bigger question is, even if you're successful, are there going to be barriers to entry? Are you going to immediately face more competition? And I think the case of the guys that Rockefeller bought out and then went right back into the business again, I mean, it sort of really shows the difficulty of barriers to entry. I mean, anybody who had knowledge of how to refine oil could have started a refinery, because Standard Oil didn't control all the petroleum, and even if they controlled all the petroleum in Pennsylvania, there were always new fields being discovered, and so even if temporarily you couldn't find something, wait a year and there'll be some new oil wells being drilled and people looking to sell that oil to somebody. And so as long as that knowledge of how to refine oil is out there, and it's hard to see how Rockefeller or Standard Oil could have had a monopoly over that, they face competition, right?
That's exactly right, and that's what the historical record showed. Is by the time that the trial was over, Standard Oil had gone from 90% market share to 64% market share. A huge part of the reason for that is because oil was discovered in Texas and Oklahoma. Well, guess what springs up all around those oil wells in Texas and Oklahoma? Lots of refiners. Mm-hmm. In 1911, there were something like 160 refineries in the United States. It was a highly competitive market. It just so happens that Standard Oil was pretty good at figuring out ways to innovate, drive down mm-hmm. costs, and ultimately decrease and lower prices, which overall benefits consumers.
And here's some numbers I think that help drive that home. These are from a paper that economist Tom DiLorenzo published a few years ago that actually looked at what was occurring in the market for petroleum over this time, right?
Exactly, and so this is the other point, right? So you kind of have two separate questions here, which is one, well, okay, was Standard Oil actually conducting predatory pricing? And then two, was it acting as a monopolist? Mm-hmm. Right. Well, to act as a monopolist, again, you have to restrict output, increase price. Well, what the data show is the exact opposite. Right. What we see is that continually through the 19th century into the 20th century, the price of petroleum and the price of kerosene is plummeting. Mm-hmm. Standard Oil's costs are plummeting, mm-hmm. and what that means, they can pass those cost savings on to consumers that leave us better off. And also, the supply of oil and the supply of kerosene skyrockets.
Mm-hmm. Growing faster than the economy. Was there? The last slide is showing the growth in petroleum relative to the growth of the economy. The economy was growing, the population was expanding. So at one level, you might expect you have to have more oil being produced anyway, but it was growing actually faster than the economy. And
exactly.
I think in the 1890s there, what that shows is I think the kerosene was starting to lose its market share to natural gas or I think electricity eventually for home heating or for home lighting. And so
yes.
That was part of the reason why we were seeing cycling in the market there.
Exactly.
I just wanted to close here by saying, getting this question, if we were going to have a law restricting predatory pricing, it would seem pretty hard to craft a law that would allow us to tell when a price cut is predatory and when it's actually just part of the competitive process. Is that true?
That's exactly right. And I think the best way to probably sum it up is Harold Demsetz, and I don't know the exact quote, but in talking about predatory pricing, he said that if you want to make predatory pricing illegal, or if you want to eliminate predatory pricing, the problem that you're also going to face is that by doing so, you're probably also going to eliminate legitimate price cuts and price reductions mm-hmm. that emerge through the competitive process and ultimately benefit consumers. And that overall is a very problematic thing.
We really don't want to make price cutting by businesses an illegal thing or a thing that we want to discourage. It's actually good for our economy and for consumers. Right? And I guess the last part of it I want to really sort of touch on here is the idea that these laws and the perception of predatory pricing still sort of persists today, right? It's something that I think that a lot of times we see is sort of a little bit below the surface in a lot of different economic discussions, right?
That's exactly right. It's something that we've heard time and again. We were talking about it just prior to this, but looking at Chinese currency manipulation. Somehow that by exporting more goods to us through this currency manipulation, we're worse off. That's just a form of dumping, right? That's what we call it, where you flood the market with a certain commodity to drive out competitors. Ultimately, that actually leaves us better off, right, at the end of the day. But that's something that we could definitely leave for another show.
Well, yeah, we probably will. And thanks for joining us, John, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.